I'm Tanya Gabrielian. I'm a Gemini. I, I started playing piano when I was 3. I started violin when I was 4, and I played flute when I was 9, very badly. And yeah, I've been playing since then. I'm playing pieces written by people that come before me. So that's sort of been my journey as a musician, to find a way to use pieces from somebody else's mind and feelings and find a way to superimpose that on my own point of view.
If we think about musical influences and shaping your sound, so not necessarily from kind of a career side, but just more of like the actual sound, who were your influences?
I'm so weird about so many things. I've never believed or had for myself role models, because everybody comes from a very specific set of circumstances that can never be replicated elsewhere. And you can certainly admire what many people have done in the past and currently do, but it's their circumstances that allows them to do that. And so if we're going to look just in terms of strict piano playing, my 2 favorites, the deceased pianist of my dreams is Rachmaninoff, and the living one is Sokolov. And the sort of what stands out for both of them is their control and planning. Rachmaninoff, for me, not just as a composer, but as a musician, his legacy has been changed so much. And that when you hear Rachmaninoff, you hear this sort of hair and hormones approach, which doesn't resonate with me. And if you listen to his playing and if you read up about him, he's very obsessed with architecture and planning and the clarity that comes from listening to his playing. And if you study his scores, that's not what we think of. If you go, you'll go to the Valentine's concert and Rock 2 will be playing, but that's, to me, not the intention of that piece for what I view of sort of what his motivators would have been, so like the Paganini variations, for example, the 18th variation, which, you can use as sort of the ultimate romantic 3 minutes of music history. He wrote that, he said, my publisher will like this movement. And it's simply an inversion of the theme. And not to say that there weren't, romantic inclinations or feelings in Rachmaninoff, or, as a side note of what this movement is, but you have to sort of distinguish between what's marketable and what's musical. And, I am personally more motivated by musical than marketable decisions. That's how I've carried myself through my life, and probably why I'm not playing as much as I'd like to. But, those characters, if you look at their life, there's very few things that I can sort of replicate, because we're very different people than these idols, these piano idols, I'll put it that way, that I have. But, I think the 2 of them for me definitely represent authenticity and integrity. And those are the 2 qualities that I value, not just as a musician, but as a person.
If you think about your kind of performances that stood out to you and were meaningful to you as a person, not necessarily fancy performances in big halls or whatever, but just the ones that impacted you as a person, can you kind of tell those stories a little bit?
I think I fall into this category with a lot of musicians of, going to concerts in a way feels like work, that your brain, you want an audience to feel things that as a performer you don't feel. Like if you're performing on stage and you're busy emoting, what happens? Okay, so when your brain recognizes emotions, it's your nerves sending signals to the brain that something's different and that there's some change. And that's that's from directly the muscles contracting. And when your muscles contract, you don't have the fine motor skills that you need in order to play with the most comfort and the most range of movement. And also when you get emotional, your brain is not necessarily thinking as clearly as you do in a premeditated way. So I just think there's it's not like what we're doing is selfless by any means. But there is a very big disconnect between the impression that we give and what's going on internally on stage, for me at least. And I think it's important to make that distinction. And now I've completely forgot about the question that we're answering. Forgive me, I haven't had coffee yet.
That's a fascinating point, though, you make, for sure. But yeah, so what I originally asked was performances that you specifically were on stage playing that were impactful to you.
Yeah. So what's impactful, I think, is in a way the audience's impression. Like I remember, I think the best compliment I've ever gotten was after a concert. Somebody came up to me and said, I haven't painted in 20 years. I'm going to go home and paint. And, for me personally, I've never viewed as something creative as a need to let myself be known by creating something. That's never been my inclination or the way that I approach music. But I recognize it's something very powerful for other people. And also the concert experience itself, I recognize that from anecdotes and what people have told me, how meaningful it can be for them. I haven't necessarily felt that also. So, what I love about a concert is that's the only time pretty much in life that you get to be authentic and you have that moment to convene with an audience and speak your truth for the 90 minutes that you're on stage. Everything else is a game, is part of the industry. So that moment to me is, and you don't know how that's received by other people. It is very selfish to be like, look at me on stage in silence while I'm on a raised pedestal in a spotlight, and you'll clap for me and tell me how wonderful I am when I finish. It's such a weird space if you look at it objectively and take out the context of what we're doing. And that for me has never sat well with me because, I don't want it to be about me. I don't want to be the center of attention. I don't want to have that artistic moment where it's my word and I'm telling you my insights in a very condescending way. And I feel like a performance on a certain level is that, yet I love doing it. And so it's this paradox of the self-awareness of it, yet the ability to pontificate on a stage also is something that I think very few people get to experience. And it's a huge honor to be able to take that space in other people's life for the moment that we do. But again, I don't know where people are coming from on stage for themselves and what it means to them. And we all know musicians that it means wildly different things for. So I've never looked at a person as sort of an untouchable role model, but tried to more understand where they're coming from. And, if you play a composer, for example, I want to understand who that person was. Would I want to hang out with them? Rather, understanding where they are contextually within music history and their own personal circumstances and musically, what's going on academically in the score and all that kind of stuff. But, it really interests me is people, their motivations and why they are who they are, and trying to understand that more so than the very surface level, sort of performance that we give to people as our quote duty as musicians, because we're just so deep.
Fascinating. Very, very fascinating. Let's take a quick break. If you're a classical musician, you know that talent alone is not enough to be seen and heard in today's marketplace. You need visibility. Over the past 15 years, I've worked as a brand strategist in classical music, working with artists and organizations, building that visibility for them. I've helped artists win Grammy Awards and nominations, such as Jessie Montgomery and the Miró Quartet, and I've helped Yoon Chan Lim achieve global stardom through my work at the Cliburn. If you're a classical musician looking for that visibility to propel you forward to attain better engagements, reach out, because I'd love to explore working with you. Simply tap the link below to explore more and schedule a time to speak with me. Now, back to the conversation. Let's talk about what's your season looking like right now, based on kind of actually your perspectives on that. I'm actually really curious then how you're kind of going about structuring your season and the kind of projects you're involved in right now.
Right. Well, I mean, like your company does marketing, so maybe we should talk after this about that. Of it's an industry. The performances that you line up are always there because you have the opportunity to do so. If a tree falls silently in a forest, will anybody hear it? I think for being a musician, this is something that I think about so much, because I could tell you, 20, 30 projects that I would love to do, but if I'm not given the opportunity to do that, the point is moot. And so, everybody is, again, coming from different circumstances of, the realities of certain people, of not having to worry about basics of necessities of living that go into music. As we all know, there is a financial insecurity that comes along with the profession that people coming from well-off means don't necessarily have to worry about. And then for those of us that do, well, we need to find work everywhere we got. So we take every concert because you don't know what it might lead to, and you need to eat. This is why musicians will always love a reception after a concert, because you don't know when your next meal's coming. So, thank you, please, and thank you. But so my next season, I moved back from Ireland actually this year. So it's really interesting, just 1 year out of the country and how that affects your schedule and your marketability. So it's been an interesting transition to come back to the States. There's a couple things that I'm very excited about doing. One that I'm still trying to raise money for, and this is a very traditional, let's say, music project that is hard to get funding because it's so traditionally based. I met Alexander Salotti's great-granddaughter in Condon, Montana. I don't know if you've heard of Condon, Montana, and that's for a very specific purpose. So I'm sorry, I'm going to go into a huge tangent. Do we have...
Go for it. Go for it. I'm curious.
Okay. So Alexander Salotti was the cousin of Rachmaninoff. So he was Rachmaninoff's teacher at the Moscow Conservatory. He was also himself a pupil of Tchaikovsky and Liszt. And so he sort of is this very pivotal person in music history. He was also a presenter. So he was responsible for Prokofiev getting I think Prokofiev's getting performances, Scriabin getting his first publisher. I mean, bringing Pablo Casals to Russia, and, just who he was in Russia, it cannot be understated, I think. But because he's on the cusp of sort of pre-recordings, and he didn't compose necessarily, he arranged and edited. So he's sort of been lost in the fold. But I've always been obsessed with his transcriptions, and I recorded some of them on my last album. And so when I met this woman, I knew exactly who she was. And so the story was, so he, after the Russian Revolution, he moved to New York, taught at Juilliard, almost got fired from Juilliard because he wasn't bringing in students. So the same stories going on now are very much have been historically the same. Music is dying. We don't have audiences. I think people have been saying that for as long as people are going to concerts. So he lived in New York. 2 generations later, his grandson, this was during the Cold War. And, how Japanese were put in internment camps during World War II, they thought Russians would have the same treatment by American government. So they moved to literally the middle of nowhere, which was Condon, Montana. So they've been living in Montana since then. And she herself doesn't really play piano that much. And so she knows sort of the history of the family, but not really seeing the effect in the music world of the legacy that her family has really brought into existence. And so she also had lots of scores from his personal collection that have not seen the light of day. So I literally went to her house in a log cabin in snowy Montana. It was January, right before the pandemic, 2020. And there were piles in Tupperware containers of music that I went through. And so I found new transcriptions, new editions. So I've been playing some of those. I cross-referenced them with 2 of his archives, which are at Stanford University and at the International Piano Archives in University of Maryland. And then there are some concerti also. So the Tchaikovsky First Concerto. So as a pupil and also the editor for Tchaikovsky, he was playing with Tchaikovsky on his first European tour. And what happened was he then oversaw the second edits for that, but then he made further edits. And I've played Tchaikovsky since I was, younger. And so there's always parts of the piece that I'm like, something feels a little off. And those changes are in the edition. And so I got to premiere that a couple years ago with Knoxville Symphony. And so I'm going to try to record them, which will be very exciting. And I think this also leads us to sort of how music is funded in the way that, it's very hard to get funding for a composer, well, especially now from Russia, who is deceased and white. And, it's time to make other voices known. But it also, to me, when we talk about diversity, which is sorely needed in music, and I'm going to pretend that what's going on in the government is not happening now, because we need to understand that we are a country of immigrants, and diversity is integral to our existence as Americans. But again, it's very hard to get funding for a project like this. And so another project that I'm working on for next year is, because America's 250th anniversary is coming up. Again, when we talk about diversity in music, it becomes a black and white issue. And I think there are so many colors of the rainbow that still have yet to get the proper recognition that they need. So myself, I'm half Asian, half Middle Eastern. I think it was last year that Middle East and North Africa just became a category for the next census. And so, you're never going to look at someone from Iran being white, but technically we are. So, looking at voices that just make up the American landscape from, all corners of the world, and playing these pieces, the common being, they're all living in America or they've immigrated to America, and how that, gives us so much more value of, what we're doing today, and how we view ourselves, and how easy to understand all this music is, and how it really connects us. Something that I do feel also needs to be addressed is that just playing these pieces in the same halls doesn't do anything different. We're selling tickets for the same ticket prices. We're, for the same audiences. And it often feels like we're just checking off boxes to get more funding or to do a project that, has some meaning, rather than in a way just to put them as equals. It's almost like you do the obligatory check, which I think is absolutely the wrong way of doing it. And I'm sure I'm being very offensive in my language here now, but I do think that we need to look at the entire landscape of people, and focus on, to me, the way that this needs to be approached is music education, and just education in general. Why is education not more of an issue? I mean, what's going on right now with the Department of Education? Let's not get into that, because we don't have, 13 days to talk about this. But, what really needs to happen is we need to give our next generation the opportunities that the previous generation didn't have. And as a musician, as an artist, as anybody in the creative field, I think your value is as an educator for the audiences that you are able to touch, and finding ways to get more people involved in the art that you do. And I think that's the direction that I would like to take going forward, not just being in a survivalist mode, which I often am as a musician, of, where's my next gig? So if I have the ability to move in that direction, I'll be very happy.
Excellent. Yeah. I mean, I think our listeners will find that really, really fascinating, your perspective. I am curious to kind of circle back to the funding and finding funding. I think our listeners would be interested in how an artist can even go about that. I mean, I know that there's different sources of that, I mean, from grants to private philanthropy to, family, et cetera. But, any kind of further thing you want to say about funding?
I don't want to get blacklisted or get no more of the funding that I do get. But I mean, if you just imagine, if we look at how a nonprofit is funded, and I can talk about this endlessly, it is primarily from grants and individual donations. And ticket sales make up maybe a third of a well-run organization, 25% probably more likely. So in order to keep an organization existing, you have to make sure that your main funding source is happy, i.e. donors and grants. When you're looking at sort of donors, individual donors that fit into the philanthropic world, they're coming from a specific economic class, and B, they often want recognition for what they're doing in a way that, they're part of it. They know it's their money. And now I'm not saying this is true for all the situations, but very often the ones that you work with more in depth and more regularly, because they're being very instrumental in keeping the organization alive, normally flex some sort of power dynamic with you. And I think the perfect example of this was, there was the movie with Meryl Streep, Florence Foster Jenkins. And I don't know if you've seen that movie, but I mean, Florence Foster Jenkins is a lovely anecdote in musical history to explore if you haven't had the chance yet, anyone. But
It's an amazing film. Yes,
yeah,
it
and
is. It's amazing.
yeah, I mean, she's basically a tone deaf rich woman who wants to
Yeah,
sing.
incredible.
And, there's a scene where somebody comes up to, I can't remember what conductor it is, but somebody super well known, being very obsequious and flattering her and, wanting to keep her in the good graces. And that sadly is the way that we have to exist often in order just to get the opportunity to do what we do. Because again, music is a luxury item. Everybody, oh, I need music to live. No, you really don't. It makes your life better and it gives your life a different type of meaning, perhaps, but you don't need music to survive. So, to look at it in sort of that view makes it a little bit less emotional and connected because people performing feel it's their life's work, and it's very hard to separate your identity as a musician as yourself as a person. And to me, if you don't make that distinction, you're going to be severely hurt for the rest of your life in music. You've got to keep some sense of reality and have a strong identity away from your work in order just to stay alive and to be okay with the whims of the powers that be, because none of it's personal, and you have to make sure to keep that distinction separate.
Moving on, and this is the last part of the podcast, which is our quick fire round. So
Okay.
just short answers in terms of these questions. What's one talent you have that would surprise our listeners?
I mean, it would surprise me too, because I feel like a very untalented person. I can touch my toes without bending down. I have super long monkey arms. I don't know. I can't think of anything.
If you could collaborate with any artist, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
Oh, see, I mean, like my two idols in that sense would be Bach and Mozart, but I can't improvise if you held a gun to my head. So between the two of them, I would be too embarrassed to even play a note. So yeah, I would like to just watch them rather than collaborate. How's that?
If you weren't a musician, what other profession do you think you'd pursue?
I'd be in the medical field.
What's the first thing you do in the morning that helps set the tone for your day?
I'm so bad at keeping a routine. Maybe that's what I should do to set the mood for the rest of my day. So yeah, any ideas besides getting enough caffeine would be very welcome.
And last question, what does success mean to you?
Success means being able to be happy with the work that you've done and know that you've been true to yourself and not have to live on the street. So it's a fine balance to me.